Despite a consensus in Washington that America needs more investment in our infrastructure, it's been decades since Congress passed a standalone bill to address the issue. This Congress is working hard to remedy that fact. As I've repeated, discussions about infrastructure are moving forward along two tracks. One is bipartisan. The second deals with components of the American Jobs and Families Plan, which we will consider even if it lacks bipartisan support. Though I would note, a recent poll showed that President Biden's Infrastructures and Families Plan is broadly popular. Nearly 70% of Americans support President Biden's infrastructure plan. More than 60% support additional support for American families. Now, despite some over-dramatized punditry, the truth is both tracks are moving forward very well, and both tracks need each other. So we want to work with our Republican colleagues on infrastructure where we have common ground. And Democrats believe we have other priorities that the Senate must consider above and beyond a bipartisan infrastructure bill, not the least of which is addressing the urgent challenge of climate change. Yesterday, I convened all 11 members of the Senate Budget Committee to discuss the reconciliation track. And today, I'll convene the group of Democrats negotiating with Republicans to discuss the bipartisan track. We set up the two tracks about a month ago. Each is proceeding along, and the two tracks are parallel, working in concert, progressing well. On voting rights. Now we're here on the precipice of a momentous debate here in the Senate. Last night, I began the process to consider voting rights legislation here on the floor of the Senate next week. The process I used will allow the Senate to consider S1 or compromise legislation that is currently being discussed. In either case, our goal remains crystal clear: protect the right to vote, strengthen our democracy, and put a stop to the tide of voter suppression flooding across our country. We will not consider legislation that does not achieve those objectives. The issue is too important. Republican state legislatures are conducting the most sweeping attack on the right to vote since the beginning of Jim Crow. What is their stated reason for vicious assaults on voting rights? They say it's election integrity. But listen to these policies and tell me if you think they're about election integrity. Reducing polling hours in polling places. What does that have to do with election integrity? Mandating that every precinct, no matter how large or how small, have the same number of ballot drop boxes. What does that have to do with election integrity? It's saying urban areas should have less ability to vote than rural areas. No after-hours voting, no 24 hours voting, no drive-through voting, requiring absentee ballots to be approved by a notary public, making it a crime to give food and water to voters waiting in long lines at the polls, allowing a judge or panel of judges to overturn an election, allowing a partisan state election board to replace a duly elected county election board if they're, quote, underperforming, removing student IDs from the list of valid forms of ID, moving the hours of Sunday voting into the evening, which coincidentally makes it harder for black churches to sponsor voter drives after services. Are any of these policies, I'd ask a single Republican on this Senate floor to get up and say any of these policies are dealing with election integrity? We know what they're doing. They're making it harder for people to vote. And if this so-called voter fraud, election fraud, which we've seen none of in 2020, if they cared about that across the board, why do they aim almost all their proposals at people of color, at poor people, at young people, at urban people? We know why. This is not about voter fraud. It's about suppressing the vote, particularly of Democratic-leaning voters. It's despicable. It's anti-democratic. It's what they do in dictatorships. Manipulate the vote instead of counting it accurately.